The boy stood alone at the center of the vast, glittering stage, his shoes scuffed thin at the toes, his jacket borrowed 2 sizes too big, the lights above him burning so bright they felt like a second sun, and for a brief moment he wondered if he should run, because everything about this place, the roaring crowd, the cameras floating like mechanical birds, the judges seated behind a polished desk, felt like a world he was never meant to enter, a world far removed from the cracked sidewalks and tin-roofed rooms where he had learned to sing not for applause but for survival. And as the host finished announcing his name, a name that barely rippled through the audience because no one recognized it, the boy swallowed hard and told himself to breathe, because his mother had always said that when life feels too heavy, the first brave thing you do is breathe, and so he did, slowly, deeply, the way he had learned while sitting beside her hospital bed when the machines beeped softly and the nights felt endless. And as the judges looked him over, one raising an eyebrow, another glancing down at their notes, and Simon, arms crossed, expression unreadable, the boy felt that familiar sting of being underestimated, the same look teachers gave him when his uniform was worn, the same look shopkeepers gave when he counted coins too slowly, the same look doctors gave when they saw the address on his forms and assumed they already knew his story. But what none of them knew was that this boy's voice had been shaped by hunger and hope, by loss and love, by lullabies sung in darkness and prayers whispered through tears. And when Simon leaned forward and asked, not unkindly but not warmly either, "Tell us why you're here," the boy hesitated, then answered in a voice so quiet it almost broke, "I'm here because my mom can't sing anymore." And the audience murmured, sensing something deeper beneath the simple words, and Simon pressed, "Why is that?" And the boy's fingers tightened around the microphone as he said, "She's sick, and when I sing, she smiles, even when it hurts." And for a second, something flickered in Simon's eyes, a crack in the armor, but it vanished as quickly as it came, replaced by professionalism, by distance, and he nodded, "All right then, whenever you're ready." And the music began, a soft, familiar melody. And the boy closed his eyes, not because he was afraid of the judges, but because he needed to see her, his mother, sitting on the edge of their narrow bed, humming while stirring a pot of soup made from almost nothing, telling him stories about a better tomorrow, telling him that his voice was a gift meant to travel where his feet could not. And when he opened his mouth to sing, the first note rose gently, fragile as glass, and then something extraordinary happened, because that note didn't just fill the room. It carried with it the weight of every night he had gone to sleep hungry so his mother could eat. Every morning he had woken early to work odd jobs before school. Every moment he had felt invisible, and the audience stilled, conversations dying mid-whisper, phones lowering, hearts leaning forward, and Simon's pen froze above the paper as the boy's voice grew stronger, richer, wrapping sorrow and hope into a single sound that seemed to tremble with honesty. And as the song unfolded, it became clear that this wasn't just a performance, it was a confession, a thank you, a plea, a promise, because he sang about holding on when the lights go out, about finding strength in broken places, about loving someone so deeply that their pain becomes your own, and tears welled in the eyes of strangers who had never known his streets, his struggles, his losses, but somehow recognized the truth in his voice. And halfway through the song, Simon's composure faltered, his jaw tightening, his gaze dropping for a moment as if the boy's voice had reached somewhere he kept carefully guarded, somewhere old and tender, because Simon, for all his sharp words and high standards, had once been a boy too, had once believed in music as a lifeline before the world taught him to armor himself with criticism. And when the boy reached the chorus, his voice soared, not loud, not showy, but pure, unwavering, and it felt like a hand reaching out, asking not for pity but for understanding. And the audience rose almost without realizing it, drawn to their feet by something greater than talent, something human. And as the final note lingered in the air, trembling like a held breath, silence fell, the kind of silence that speaks louder than applause. And in that silence, the boy lowered the microphone, his chest heaving, unsure if he had done enough, unsure if this world would make room for him. And then the room erupted, applause crashing like a wave, cheers echoing, people wiping tears they hadn't expected to shed. And the boy stood there, stunned, as Simon slowly removed his glasses, rubbing his eyes once before looking up, really looking at the boy. And when he spoke, his voice was softer than anyone had ever heard it on that stage. "I've heard thousands of singers," he said, "and most of them come here wanting to be famous, but you came here to be heard by one person, and somehow you made all of us listen." And the boy's lips trembled, because in that moment, he felt seen, not as a poor kid, not as a charity case, but as an artist, as a son, as a human being. And Simon continued, "Your voice isn't perfect, it's better than that. It's honest." And the crowd roared again, and as the judges cast their votes, each one glowing green, the boy felt a warmth spread through him, not just because he had made it to the next round, but because something deeper had shifted, because kindness had met courage, because empathy had bridged worlds. And backstage, as producers hurried past and strangers congratulated him, Simon approached quietly, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder and asking, "How's your mom doing now?" And the boy answered, "She's fighting, every day." And Simon nodded, then said something that would change the boy's life forever: "No one should fight alone." And weeks later, as the boy advanced through the competition, his story spread, not as a tale of pity, but as a testament to the power of love, and viewers across the country were moved to act. Donations poured in, letters arrived, and a foundation reached out offering medical support. And when the boy sang again, this time knowing his mother was receiving care, his voice carried a new note: gratitude. And on the night of the finale, win or lose, he sang not for the judges, not for the cameras, but for the countless people who had found a piece of themselves in his journey. And as he stepped off the stage for the last time, Simon stood and applauded, longer than anyone else, because he knew that what he had witnessed was more than talent. It was humanity at its most powerful, reminding everyone watching that sometimes the greatest voices come from the quietest places, that compassion can change the course of a life, and that when we truly listen, we don't just hear music, we hear each other. And the boy returned home not as a celebrity, but as a son who could finally tell his mother, "You don't have to be strong alone anymore." And as she smiled, tears shining in her tired eyes, he realized that this moment of shared hope was the real victory, proof that even in a world quick to judge, a single honest voice, carried by love, can soften the hardest hearts and light the darkest paths. The morning after his audition aired, the boy woke to a sound he had never heard before, his phone vibrating non-stop on the small wooden table beside his mattress, the screen lighting up the dim room again and again with missed calls, messages, numbers he didn't recognize. And for a moment he panicked, thinking something terrible had happened, because in his life silence usually meant safety and noise meant trouble. But then his mother stirred on the bed across the room, coughing softly, smiling faintly despite the pain, and said, "It's okay, answer it." And when he did, the voice on the other end trembled with excitement, telling him that millions of people had watched him sing, that his story had touched hearts across the country, that people were asking how they could help. And he sank onto the edge of the bed, overwhelmed, because all he had wanted was to make his mother smile for 3 minutes on a stage. And now the world was knocking on his door, a world he had never imagined would even notice him. And as the days passed, life moved faster than he could process, interviews replacing odd jobs, rehearsals replacing bus rides, and yet every night, he returned to the same small room, sitting beside his mother, singing softly to her as he always had, because fame, even in its earliest flicker, meant nothing compared to the simple act of holding her hand and feeling her squeeze back. And though the judges praised him week after week, Simon's words stayed with him most deeply, not because they came from a man known for harshness, but because they had been spoken with understanding. And Simon checked in quietly, off camera, asking about his mother, making calls without announcing them, reminding the boy that kindness didn't need an audience. And when the foundation confirmed they would cover his mother's treatment, the boy wept openly for the first time in years, not the quiet tears he had learned to cry alone, but sobs that shook him, releasing fear he had carried far too long. And when he told his mother, she laughed through tears and said, "Your voice didn't just save me, it saved you too." And as the competition continued, the boy faced new pressures, online critics dissecting his every note, strangers arguing whether he deserved his place, voices louder than doubt itself. But each time fear crept in, he remembered the nights he had sung to drown out hunger, the mornings he had sung to keep hope alive, and he realized that if his voice had carried him this far, it could carry him through anything. And the semifinal performance came with a twist, a song choice Simon himself suggested, something raw, stripped of spectacle. And when the boy stepped onto the stage that night, the lights dimmed low, and he sang as if he were back in that small room again, just him and the truth. And Simon didn't hide his reaction, tears streaking down his face as he stood with the crowd, because the boy's voice no longer just told a story, it healed something broken in everyone listening, and when the final results were announced, whether he won or placed second hardly mattered, because the transformation had already occurred, and in the weeks that followed, the boy returned home to a life changed forever, not by luxury, but by security, by the gift of time, by watching his mother grow stronger day by day, and when he visited schools and shelters to sing for children who reminded him of himself, he told them, "Your voice doesn't have to be loud to be powerful, it just has to be honest." And years later, long after the lights of the show had faded, people would still share his audition, not because of the judges, not because of the drama, but because it reminded them of something essential, that compassion can rise from the poorest places, that listening is an act of love, and that sometimes, a single voice, born in struggle and lifted by kindness, can soften even the hardest hearts and change the course of many lives, forever. Time, gentle and unrelenting, moved forward, and with it the boy, no longer just the poor kid with the borrowed jacket, no longer the trembling figure under blinding lights, but a young man learning how to carry a gift without letting it weigh him down. Because after the show ended and the world's attention shifted to the next sensation, he discovered something many never do, that purpose lasts longer than applause, and though opportunities came flooding in, contracts promising quick fame and polished images, he chose carefully, remembering the cracked sidewalks that had shaped him, remembering that his voice was never meant to impress but to connect, and he spent months at his mother's side as her health slowly improved, watching color return to her face, laughter replace exhaustion, mornings filled with sunlight instead of fear, and every small victory, every step she took without pain, every night she slept peacefully, felt more precious than any trophy, and when she finally stood in the audience for one of his intimate concerts, her hands trembling as she clapped, he sang directly to her, tears blurring the stage lights, knowing that everything had begun with a promise whispered in a dark room, and he kept that promise not by chasing fame but by returning to the places that had raised him, singing in shelters, community halls, hospitals, where people didn't ask for autographs but for hope, and it was there he truly understood the power of kindness, because every time he listened to someone else's story, his own grew richer, deeper, more human, and Simon, watching from afar, occasionally reaching out with a brief message or quiet encouragement, realized that the boy's greatest achievement wasn't changing a judge's heart but reminding millions that empathy still mattered. And years later, when asked in interviews about that legendary audition, the young man would smile softly and say, "It wasn't about that note, it was about being heard for the first time," and parents would send letters saying their children dared to dream because of him. Strangers would confess they chose compassion over judgment after hearing his voice, and even critics would admit that some performances linger not because of perfection but because of truth. And when he eventually founded a small music program for underprivileged kids, no cameras, no fanfare, he stood in a modest room filled with nervous voices and said the same words his mother once told him, "Breathe, your story matters." And in that moment, the echo of his journey came full circle, because the boy who once sang to survive was now teaching others to sing to live. And as his mother watched from the back of the room, pride shining brighter than any stage light, he realized that the real miracle wasn't that Simon couldn't handle his voice. It was that the world finally listened, and kept listening, long after the music ended, carrying forward a simple, enduring truth, that even from the poorest beginnings, a voice fueled by love, kindness, and humanity can rise high enough to change lives, including our own. As the years layered themselves gently over his life, the young man came to understand that some journeys don't end with triumph but begin there, because success did not arrive as a finish line but as a doorway, opening into responsibilities he never anticipated, and there were nights when the weight of it all pressed on his chest heavier than hunger ever had. The expectations, the letters asking him to save what music alone could not, the fear of disappointing those who had placed their hope in his voice, but in those moments, he returned to the same ritual that had carried him through childhood, sitting quietly, breathing slowly, listening before singing, because he had learned that the most powerful part of his gift wasn't the sound itself, but the space it created for others to feel less alone. And it was during one such quiet night, after a small charity concert in a forgotten town, that a boy approached him backstage, thin, nervous, eyes downcast, and whispered, "I sound like nothing," and the young man knelt to meet his gaze and said gently, "I did too," until someone listened, and he invited the boy to sing, not on a stage, not into a microphone, but right there in the silence. And when the boy's shaky voice emerged, imperfect and trembling, the young man felt the same ache he had once carried, the ache of wanting to be seen, and he clapped softly, smiling, and in that simple moment of recognition, a spark lit, because kindness, he realized, doesn't always change the world loudly, sometimes it changes one life quietly, and those quiet changes ripple farther than applause ever could. And his mother, now stronger, now walking beside him instead of lying in bed waiting, watched these moments with tears she no longer tried to hide, knowing that her greatest legacy wasn't the sacrifices she had made, but the compassion she had passed on. And when illness eventually returned, as it sometimes does, relentless and unfair, the young man faced it not with fear but with gratitude, holding her hand as she once held his, singing softly as she rested, and she whispered, "You were always enough," words that settled into his soul like a final blessing. And when she was gone, the world expected him to fall silent, to disappear beneath grief, but instead, he sang, not in grand arenas, but in quiet places, letting his sorrow weave into his music, because he understood now that pain shared honestly becomes healing. And one evening, invited back to the same stage where everything had begun, he stood once more under the lights, older, steadier, carrying loss and love in equal measure, and Simon, seated again behind the desk, met his eyes with something like reverence, because they both knew this was more than a reunion. It was a testament, and when the young man sang, the room filled not with spectacle but with remembrance, every note carrying the truth of where he had come from and why he still sang. And when the final note faded, Simon stood first, not clapping, but placing a hand over his heart, and the audience followed, many in tears, because they weren't applauding a performance, they were honoring a journey. And later, when asked what had changed since that first audition, the young man answered simply, "I learned that even silence is listening, if you're brave enough to speak from the heart." And as he walked off the stage for the last time, he felt no fear of being forgotten, because he knew now that voices born of love do not fade. They echo in the lives they touch, teaching the world, again and again, that compassion can rise from poverty, that humanity can soften even the hardest judges, and that sometimes, the greatest song is not the one that stuns the room, but the one that teaches silence how to sing.